First of all, look at the lion there on the wall. So that's from Nebuchadnezzar's palace, okay, in Babylon. Those are the original tiles, that's an original piece. 2,500 years old, the Babylonian lion. So if you see each of those tiles, if you pulled them out, they would be like a shelf. They're deep, and they would have. It's going to be around the other side. Each of those tiles, when you pull them out, has an inscription on it, telling you that it was done by Nebuchadnezzar. It was his building. It was his thing that was being done. So that's quite remarkable. And the colour and the sort of lustre, bearing in mind these are scattered all over the place in the desert and have been brought back together. If you go to Berlin, there's a reconstruction of the entranceway to his palace called the Ishtar Gate, and that's quite it would have been awesome in its day, in the Babylonian sunlight, if you like. Come here quickly. All right, I want you to see where the rest. If you want photographs of anything, I'll just point them out and I'll talk about them in a minute. So this here, this is a stele with the last king of Babylon, who is called Nabonidus. Okay, very important piece. Along there on the green board, on the far end, is a cylinder. And we will talk about that in a minute, but if you've got the book, it will be in there. So we talked about, we saw the lion, okay, Nebuchadnezzar's lion. Very important, just think about that. Nebuchadnezzar was a builder, a monument builder, a temple builder, a palace builder. He loved all that sort of stuff, and he did it in those fired clay glazed bricks. So you can imagine just how many of those bricks that were used in his kingdom. Remember, he stood up at one point and says, this is the great Babylon that I have built, and it didn't go well for him after that, you remember. Interestingly, with some of the monuments down in you saw behind me probably the picture of the ziggurat, the temple of the moon god in That looks fairly new and modern and nice and crisp, and not 4,000 odd years old. And the reason is Saddam Hussein in Iraq declared himself to be the new Nebuchadnezzar. And he was a monument builder, so all these ancient monuments in these places, he was actually building and restoring, and many of them he did the same as Nebuchadnezzar did. In the bricks he used had an inscription saying, the great king did this. So he was copying that, so there's no question about that. But just think about the book of Daniel, right? Because this is very important. There are loads and loads of cultural references in Daniel which help us to lock it into the time frame it claims to be from. And you need to know this, because the accusation of the historians and the archaeologists and anyone who has a beef with the Bible, the accusation is this: you've got the book of Daniel, which purports to be written in sort of 500-ish BC, and yet it contains chapters of prophecy which from our point of view have all come true, right? So you've got the early parts of Daniel, which are the story bits that we like most. Then you've got all this prophetic stuff, and we can identify the unfolding of history in those prophetic parts. Alexander the Great and the Seleucid and Ptolemaic pharaohs and all that kind of stuff. It's all in there. The timeline of Christ, the 70s and all of that. It's all in there, and it's all, if it's written in 500 BC, it's all prophecy. So if you're coming from a secular viewpoint and you don't believe in prophecy, you don't believe that anyone can tell you the future, you've got to explain the book of Daniel away in a different way. And so what do you say? Well, it's very simple. Whoever wrote Daniel waited until most of this stuff had happened and then wrote it down as if he was prophesying it. So it puts it around 160 BC. The writer is 160 BC in Jerusalem at the time of the Maccabean revolt, and he's writing a history of Israel that sort of justifies their existence. Remember, no internet, no Google, no real history books. You've got no access to anything. If you are writing in that age a book that is purporting to be written 300-400 years before, you are going to make loads of cultural and historical mistakes. No question about it. Even the language you're using is 5th century BC Aramaic rather than 2nd century BC Aramaic, when you get Aramaic in there, because you do. So you've got all of that to contend with. How do we prove that the book of Daniel was written when it says it was written? And wonderfully, he's left us a load of clues in there. And think about that lion, okay, that glazed brick lion. When Daniel's friends, who've been exported down to Babylon, fall out with the king, they're sentenced to a punishment. What is the punishment they're sentenced to? Because they won't bow down before the idol the king has made. What's the punishment they're sentenced to? They're sentenced to burn in a fiery furnace. Why is that actually not just some random thought of the king? Why is it an obvious punishment for that particular moment in time?
Because he's firing the tiles.
Because he's firing millions of glazed tiles. All around the city of Babylon are the fiery furnaces that are producing those glazed clay tiles that will keep their colour for 2,500 years. It's, we just think it's a great PowerPoint for the Sunday school, don't we? Wow. We can have somebody burning and they don't burn, there's an extra guy and it's all great, But it's not, it's culturally right on the money. He knows what he's talking about. It all gets better, by the way, because you think, okay, fair enough. When Daniel gets into trouble with another king later on, still in Babylon, he gets in trouble with the king because he's praying to another god rather than to the king. What's his punishment?
The den of lions.
The den of lions. Why is it an obvious punishment for the kings of that day to throw Daniel in a den of lions? The answer's in the same piece. What's on the piece?
A lion.
A lion. The lion is the symbol of Babylonian power. All the way around the palace are wooden cages of lions that he has captured with his own hands out there in the desert. And we walked past the lion hunts of the Assyrian kings earlier. They didn't really capture them with their own hands. They took their soldiers with them, and loads of the soldiers got killed in the process. But the king has got all these lions everywhere. And if you're going to defy me, Daniel, you can face the lions, because that's the symbol of my power. So again, it's not just a great PowerPoint, and again, when you see pictures of that, I don't mind pictures of this stuff, it's fine, but when you see pictures of Daniel in the lion's den, what would you guess his age is from those pictures? 18. How old is he? 80. Wow. He's been in captivity since the beginning. So he's got to be around 80 years. Can you imagine that? A life of faithful service to God, and you get thrown in the lion's den. What do? You snuggle up against the lion and wait for the king to have a terrible night and come back and get you. It's just how it works. But what's the clincher? What's the big thing? Well, when we just looked at those last two items, the steel with the king of Babylon, Nabonidus, and the little cylinder, it seemed for a very long time that actually whoever wrote Daniel made a big mistake. Because you remember Belshazzar's feast, you know that? Yeah. The last moments of Babylon as a kingdom. Belshazzar's the king. He has this drunken orgy. He uses the stuff from the temple that Nebuchadnezzar had robbed the temple of. It wasn't the original stuff, that had long gone, by the way. But he used the stuff from the temple, and it's all bad news. The writing appears on the wall, and the king says, I think he can read the writing, he just doesn't know what it means. And his wife says, there's an old guy around here who's good at this sort of stuff. And so he says, well, get him for me. And Daniel, again, he must be 70s, 80s, scoots down the palace corridor on his mobility scooter, screeches in front of the king, and the king says, if you can tell me what this means, I'll make you third ruler in the kingdom. And Daniel says, well, it's a nice offer, but it's not really going to work out that way. Here's why, because your days have been counted and numbered and they've come to an end. Your life has been weighed in God's scales and it's been found wanting, and your kingdom is about to be divided. And at that time, Cyrus, the king of the Medo-Persian Empire, is falling on Babylon. And he falls on Babylon Belshazzar is captured and put to death. Daniel manages to scuttle away and secure his position there because God is protecting him. And that's where the problem lies, because we're writing in sort of 500-ish BC, and the problem is that the last king of Babylon is not Belshazzar. It's that other guy on the black stone, Nabonidus. And we know from secular history that when Cyrus took Babylon, he captured Nabonidus, and he didn't put him to death, he banished him. So now we've got some awkward kind of clunking, grating gears that aren't really working. So everybody goes, well, that's a sigh of relief, because if Daniel gets his history wrong, his prophecy is irrelevant. So you see how crucial this is. If he makes a historical mistake, the prophetic part of his book is gone. And so for a very long time, that was just what everybody's assumed. It's written by a later author, it's written back into history. Although he's done very well with the cultural stuff and the language, he's made a mistake. The last king isn't Belshazzar. Until, again, the 1800s, our time, an archaeologist is working at where the temple of the moon god is, the big ziggurat on the picture behind me down there. He's working on that ziggurat, and he finds in each corner of the ziggurat a cylinder. Hopefully you've got a picture of it, or if not, it's in the book. Little cylinder. And the cylinder is a note to God. And when that cylinder, because it's cuneiform text again, when that cylinder was read and translated, the jaws of historians were hitting the ground again. You know, they've only just sort of repaired the bruises from the last time this happened, but they're hitting the ground again because there was no way in the world anyone saw this coming. It's a little cylinder, and it explains a lot about the last moments of Babylon. Nabonidus was definitely the last king. But the point is, we now know he was hugely unpopular with the people. They hated him. It was a religious conflict that I could go into, but I'll just leave for the moment. They hated him. And so what you did as king in those days, if your people hate you and you're always getting grief and aggravation, you just go away a lot. And he goes on grand tours and expeditions doing all kinds of wonderful things. And at one point, the museum will tell you there on the plaque next to these pieces, he goes away for 10 years. Not 10 weeks, because that's a holiday, right? 10 months, that's a sabbatical. 10 years he's gone. And while he's on his sort of grand tour for 10 years, staying away from his kingdom, he goes to where the temple of his god is, the temple of the moon god, Sin or Nana, doesn't matter what you call him. That's his god. The temple's ruined, so he stays there for ages doing the temple up. And then he has a problem. When he's finished doing the temple up, he doesn't know whether God is there or not. Because does his God live in a torn down, shattered old temple? Probably not. So you solve the problem in those days by leaving God a note. Okay? And in this case, he left a note in each corner just in case God didn't look in the right place. Because this is how it works. Okay? It's all a bit strange to us, but this is how they think, right? And he leaves a note in each corner. When those notes were found, and that's an original one in there, it basically says this, dear moon god, while you're out, I did the place up. I hope you like what I've done. He talks about his great kingship and all this kind of stuff. And then right at the end, quite incidentally, for the first time in 2,500 years, he says, oh, by the way, please look after my boy Belshazzar, taking care of the place while I'm gone. And that is the first time in 2,500 years since Daniel wrote that the name Belshazzar appeared. Which means this, if you're in 2nd century BC trying to write a book about something that happened in another place 300 years before, you have never heard the name Belshazzar. If you're going to make up that book as a fiction, the only king you would ever put in there is Nabonidus. And Daniel says, no, it's not Nabonidus I have to deal with. I have to deal with this Belshazzar bloke, day in, day out. Plus it explains that reference of Belshazzar to Daniel, who says, if you can tell me what this means, I will make you what? Third ruler in the kingdom. Why third ruler? Because Belshazzar is not number one. He's number two. And then suddenly you realise nobody could have written Daniel unless they were there at the time. And that means, friends, thankfully, the prophecy in Daniel that we know has unfolded and come true, even in the coming of Christ and the unfolding of history, is real prophecy from a real God. And then you think about the book of Isaiah. In Isaiah, God constantly says, you know I'm God because I tell you stuff that's going to happen in the future. And when it happens, you'll know it's me that's done it. That's how we know he's God, because I tell you stuff before it happens. And Daniel does that. And that's why all the weight of sort of academic history is against Daniel, because it really does contain stuff that was written hundreds of years before it took place. And even if you wait to 2nd century BC, the coming of Christ still happens exactly when Daniel said it would, according to the 70s. And you're still 200 years before that, so you're in trouble whichever way you do.